Good afternoon, everyone. I'm June Rawl, and I'm so happy you could join us today for IPDay's Webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar is all about moving our data. 4 critical factors that impact your NRS data: enrollment, attendance, retention, post-testing rates, and performance. Today, facilitating our webinar is an administrator from Miami-Dade County Public Schools, Maria Gutierrez. But before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping rules. You know that your microphones are muted and you are in listen-only mode. We have a large crowd today, and I want you to put your Q&A questions in that Q&A option on the screen. But keep in mind, if we don't get to all your questions today, we will be sending you an email with the responses. So know that the webinars are recorded and they are archived and will be available on the IPDay website within 48 hours. I will point out to you that all the materials today are already loaded on the IPDay website. So you have all the information you need right at your fingertips. So we have a lot to talk about, a jam-packed session today. So Maria, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, June, and welcome all to today's webinar training. I'm really excited today about sharing some critical information on ways that you can improve or increase your NRS performance data. So let's look at some of the training objectives for today. We are going to look, like June said, at 4 critical factors that impact your NRS data. And we'll look at the training into 2 different parts. The first part is very simple. We're going to talk the talk. So you're going to learn how the vocabulary that's involved, the lingo. And then the second part, we're going to start walking that talk. As we learn to talk the talk, we're going to first look at some very key terms. We're going to look at what is NRS, what is a WITIS year, what is a measurable skill gain. Next, we will delve into the following, which is the federal and state updates, some measurable skill gains or LCP reporting requirements, and we're going to look at the infamous formula for NRS performance. In the second part, as we learn to walk the talk, we will first gain an overview of the 4 critical factors that impact our NRS performance. These 4 factors, as June opened up with, is enrollment, attendance and retention, your post-testing rate, and your post-testing performance. We will also look at a critical timeline of events before moving on to strategies, best practices, and resources for each of these 4 critical components. And finally, we will end the session with a reflection and a Q&A. So is everyone ready? If you are, let's get started. So let's learn to talk the talk. Before we look at the 4 critical factors that impact the NRS performance data, let's first establish what we refer to when we talk about NRS performance data. What does it mean? What elements must be taken into consideration when defining NRS performance? Well, first of all, you've got to know that NRS is an acronym for National Reporting System. And this National Reporting System for Adult Education, NRS, is an outcome-based accountability system for the state-administered, federally funded adult education program. Developed by the U.S. Department of Education's Division of Adult Education and Literacy, DAEL is what a lot of us refer to, the NRS continues a cooperative process through which state adult education directors and DAEL manage a reporting system that demonstrates learner outcomes for adult education. Now, the online NRS database is a performance and financial reporting system designed to collect aggregate statewide data from formula grantees on an annual basis. The data, though reported annually, is reported according to WITIS year, not calendar or fiscal year. So I guess the next question for us is going to be, well, what is a WITIS year? I'm going to next address this, but in a minute, but I want to emphasize that this information is more for public school districts specifically. than it is for the colleges, as their reporting is slightly different. Well, let's talk about the WITIS here. WITIS is short for Workforce Development Information Systems. And for all practical purposes, let's introduce the school year first, since we're familiar with that. Here in this slide, you have an example of how one agency's schedule overlaps with WITIS reporting. Each agency sets its own timeline of what gets reported during the 3 reporting windows. So for example, Agency A may run a July 1st through June 30 reporting year, while Agency B runs a May 1st through April 30 reporting year. So be sure that you know what your local reporting dates are for each survey. Now back to the school year, it begins on July 1st and runs through June 30th of the following year. The WITIS year, however, is different. The WITIS year is based on 3 trimesters. In this example that you see here, it runs from April of the current year to April of the following year. So let's take a closer look at the example on this chart. If we look at the 2019-2020 WITIS year, we can see that it actually begins in the 2018-19 school year, and then it runs into the 2019-20 school year. And again, please note that your district may refer to the WITIS year as an NRS reporting year. All right, so back to this chart. There are really 5 survey periods in total, but for this particular training, we are going to focus on the 3 basic survey periods, since the other 2 address courses that kind of overlap across these 3 basic periods. So during these survey periods, data is collected with specific submission deadline dates for the state and federal governments. And by looking at the trimester column, you can see that these months correlate to the start and end dates for each trimester. The focus of this training is on exploring factors that impact your NRS data for these survey periods. And this is data which is submitted to the state. So we will not be looking at all the details pertaining to the WITIS year. We're simply going to look at an overall picture so that you gain a handle on how the data is reported and which dates or time periods are significant for you. All right, so now you've got WITIS year down. Let's look at how performance is measured. A measurable skill gain, or MSG, is used to demonstrate participants' progress toward achieving a credential or employment. For adult education program, participants can demonstrate MSG in 3 different ways: by educational functional level, which is EFL, by receipt of a secondary school diploma, or for students who exited and were found enrolled in post-secondary by the end of that reporting year. For this training, we are going to be looking at MSG in the AGE and specifically ESOL and ABE programs. If you want to read additional information about the NRS, you can refer to the Technical Assistance Guide for Performance Accountability under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And you have the link right here if you want to access that later. Now, let's go back to the question. What is a measurable skill gain? There are 5 types of measurable skill gains under the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, and most of us just refer to that as WIOA. So for adult education, again, there are only 3 recognized types of measurable skill gains. 1 is a valid LCP, or literacy completion point. 2 is the diploma or GED. And the 3rd one is students who exited and were found enrolled in post-secondary by the end of that reporting year. For this training, we're going to be looking at educational functional level gains in ESOL and ABE programs. Specifically, or basically, well, if a student makes an EFL gain when they move from one functional level to the next, that's what we're going to be emphasizing. Notice that to be able to gain that functional level increase, the student has to have an increase in their post-test scores. And that is how we're going to measure this. Let's take a look at this chart, because I always like examples. It just helps clear things up. And by the way, if you do want a large copy of this, it's in the resource handbooks, so you can always refer back to that. Let's look at the ABE and ESOL program headings. You can see the different levels for each program, along with the correlated scale score ranges by test. We will begin by looking at how a student can make a measurable skill gain in ABE. So what are the steps that you have to follow? They're numbered here. First of all, you are going to select the program. In this case, we are looking at the ABE program. Next, you're going to look at the NRS level for a particular student. This example here shows that the student is currently enrolled in an ABE2 level course. 3, you're going to select the test currently in use for your district or school, and then you're going to use TABE 1112 in this example, since the majority of our districts are using the TABE 1112 for ABE. So after you've done this, you're going to go to number 4, and you're going to identify the subject area. In this case, we're going to use reading as the example. Finally, in 5, you're going to look at the scale score range for the current NRS level placement. Now that you have all of your students' current testing and placement information, you need to look at the next scale score range that correlates to the next NRS level. In the current example, the student will need to score between a 504 to a 535 in order to gain 1 functional level. It is possible for a student to gain more than 1 functional level from pre-test to post-test. In this particular example, if the student has a pre-test score of, let's say, 447 and post-test at 536, he or she will have made 2 functional level gains, which is equal to 2 LCPs. Let's look at one additional example now under the ESOL program. So let's follow the same steps that we just followed with ABE for ESOL. First, we're going to select the program. We just said that we were going to work on ESOL. And then you're going to look at the NRS level for a particular student. Now, this current student here is currently enrolled in an ESOL 1 level course. You're going to select the test for your district or school, which is the CASAS listening test in this example. Identify the subject area, listening, since the student is on the listening track. That's what we're going to focus on. And finally, in number 5, you're going to look at the scale score range for the current NRS level placement. Now that you have all of your students' current testing and placement information, you need to look at the next scale score range that correlates to the next NRS level. In this case, the student will need to score at a 181 or above in order to gain 1 functional level. It is possible, again, for a student to gain more than 1 functional level from pre-test to post-test. In this example, if the student has a pre-test score of 170 and post-test at 190, he or she will have made 2 functional level gains, which equals 2 LCPs. Now, at this time, let me just take a minute to give you an update regarding placement in ABE and ESOL and the reporting of learning gains. Recently, on October 14th, the state held a webinar identifying some upcoming changes following a U.S. Department of Education federal monitoring visit that occurred on July 29th through August 2nd of this year. In addition to commendations and possible findings, OCTAE made some recommendations related to current policies for placement and the reporting of learning gains. You know, there's a lot of information to digest from what was provided, but I just wanted you to know that we anticipate changes regarding both topics, and these being the initial placement and the reporting of learning gains. As districts meet and decide on the best course of action in complying with state requests or directives, we at IPDAY will keep you informed, and we will update the information to reflect any changes. All right, so let's get to it. You now have a better understanding regarding the time frame for reporting data to the state. It's reported within the context of a WITIS year. You also know that a measurable skill gain, or an LCP, refers to the gain that a student makes when he or she moves from one functional level to a higher functional level. You also know that it's possible for a student to make multiple gains from pre to post tests. The next piece we're going to look at is how these gains are reported to the state. So one would think that if a student makes 3 functional gains within a WITIS year, all 3 functional gains are significant. Well, when it comes to moving a student through an ESOL or an ABE program in order to get them to CTE or other post-secondary educational options, the answer is absolutely yes. But in reality, when reporting these to the state, we only consider one LCP per student per WITIS year for accountability purposes. And you know, this is pretty significant. You really do have to have a clear understanding of the concept in order to implement changes that are going to actually yield higher NRS performance results for your program. Let's look at these examples. In example 1, the student is enrolled in the ESOL program and moves 3 functional levels from ESOL 1 to ESOL 4 with post-testing. Now, even though the student has moved 3 functional levels and 3 LCPs are reported to the state, only the LCP at the lowest functional level counts towards performance accountability. In example 2, the student is enrolled in 2 programs within the same WITIS year, ESOL and ABE. In the ESOL program, he moves out of ESOL, earns 2 LCPs, and exits the program. He then moves into the ABE program and post-tests within the same WITIS year, further earning an additional 2 LCPs in ABE. Now, in this case, 1 LCP earned at ESOL 5 and 1 LCP earned at ABE level 2 count toward performance accountability. I know this is kind of complicated, so let's look at a visual of each of these examples to gain a better understanding. Here's a visual of the first example. The student moves from ESOL 1 to ESOL 2 to ESOL 3 within the same WITIS year. So he earns 3 LCPs, 1 from ESOL 1 to 2, 1 from 2 to 3, and 1 from 3 to 4. Only 1 LCP at the lowest functional level, which is ESOL 2, counts towards your NRS performance. Here's a visual of the second example. The student moves out of ESOL 5 and exits the ESOL program within the first trimester of the WITIS year. He earns 2 LCPs. He then tape tests and is placed in ABE level 2 the second trimester. At the end of the second trimester, he post-tests and tests in ABE level 4. He has now earned 2 LCPs. Now, at this time, in trimester 3, when he's scheduled into ABE 4, he again tests, but now does not gain an LCP. So this student has gained a total of 2 LCPs in ESOL and 2 LCPs in ABE. You're allowed 1 LCP per student per WITIS year per program for NRS reporting purposes. So in this case, the ESOL LCP at functional level 6 is reported in addition to the ABE LCP at functional level 3. So you're able to report 2 LCPs within this WITIS year because each program functional gain is reported separately. And guys, please remember again that your district may refer to the WITIS year as an NRS reporting year. All right, now let's look at the NRS formula. It actually is a lot more complicated, or not really a lot, but it is a little bit more complicated than what is depicted here. But this is the gist of it. So I really want you to understand it. So I want to give you something that you can work with. Let's look at some of the non-negotiables. First of all, remember to stay within the WITIS year. Do not include any data outside of that target WITIS year. Second thing I want you to remember is to count only 1 LCP per student per program. Now, don't even worry about, which LCP is reported at which functional level. Just count 1 per student. Third, I want you to add up all of the number of students who were enrolled in the program. You're going to divide the total number of LCPs by the total number of students enrolled in the program. And this is the percent. This is your approximate NRS percentage. Now, I want you to notice that on this slide, the word denominator is highlighted. We are going to be referring to this denominator throughout the rest of this presentation because anything that negatively impacts your denominator will drastically reduce your NRS performance percent. It's unlikely that your estimated NRS percent is going to equal exactly the NRS state number, but it is a good approximation of what they should look like. It shouldn't be off by much. Now, in the few slides we've covered so far, it's easy to see where we may have a bit of a problem, right? If we look at the formula on this slide, we're not truly comparing our performance, or at least our testing performance. Normally, performance means how well your students did from pre-test to post-test, but this is not what's being reflected in this NRS formula. Here, we are identifying the number of students who move up at least one functional level within a program, and then we are dividing that number by the total number of students who were enrolled in the program. This means that we must take into consideration a whole lot more than just student test scores, and it leads us to the core of this training, exploring 4 critical factors that impact your NRS performance percent, and strategies that you can implement to make a positive impact on this performance data. All right, so let's now walk the talk, right? So now that you can already talk the talk, you know the lingo, you understand the key vocabulary, you know the formula for success, it's time to walk it. But in order to do so, we need to look at 4 critical factors. These are those 4 factors we talked about. We will begin by looking at an overall snapshot of these factors, and as we delve into each one, we will look at strategies and best practices that you can immediately, and that's the key word, implement in order to begin to move your data in a positive direction. We will also provide you with numerous resources that you can use to implement some of these key strategies and some best practices as well. All right. Here are the 4 main critical factors impacting your NRS performance rate. Each of these carry their own attainment goal and as set forth by the state, and each is listed here. So with regards to enrollment, the minimum goal should be to maintain at least 100% of your prior WITIS year's enrollment. Your retention rate needs to be at no less than 70%. Why? Because it is directly tied to your post-testing rate, and we'll look at that in a minute. The goal for post-testing is to maintain the rate at no less than 70%, and this explains why the retention rate has to be at 70% as well. If you can't retain 70% of your enrollment, you're not going to be able to test 70% of your students. And then finally, post-testing performance rate is going to be this year 41 for ABE and 43% for ESOL. All right, so I'm really excited about looking at the causes that can negatively impact these factors so that we can determine the strategies and best practices that we can implement to achieve the desired outcomes. Now, what do you really know about enrollment? Well, I don't know, but we all know one thing, and that is that student enrollment in adult education programs across the state has been steadily decreasing. And this is an area of concern and struggle for all of us in the adult education system. As we look at factors that impact our enrollment, we begin to formulate ideas that help us maintain at least 100% of our prior year's enrollment, right? So our goal for this training is to identify the critical factors impacting NRS performance, right? Well, first of all, with regard to enrollment, when is a student considered to be officially enrolled in a program for the purpose of funding? Another question that we need to ask is, when does this student begin to quote unquote count on my denominator? We're constantly working to recruit students and increase our enrollment. However, we need to be aware of certain data points that impact our enrollment numbers. You know, if a student pre-test registers for a class and attends that class for less than 10 hours, for funding purposes, this student is not counted as part of your program or school enrollment. If the same student pre-test registers and attends class for 10 hours or more, this student now counts for funding purposes. It is really important to make this distinction because the bulk of adult education program funding comes from student enrollment. So you want to be sure to capture and retain students in order to maximize program funding. Look at the first visual at the top. In this example, you have a student who pre-tests on September 6th and then begins attending class on September 9th. Each class runs about 3 hours a day, and the student is actually attending 3 hours every day. On September 12th, the student reaches his 10 hours of direct instructional time. At this moment, he begins to count as part of your denominator. If you want more information on this, by the way, you can access the technical assistance paper, and you have the link in your resource handbook. Now back to the topic. So remember that enrollment is a double-edged sword. On one side, the higher your enrollment, the higher your funding. On the other side, remember that the denominator on your NRS performance formula is the total number of students enrolled. So the more students you have enrolled in a program, the harder you have to work to ensure that they all remain enrolled, complete the program, and post-test successfully. This being said, another part of enrollment that we need to address is when a student is withdrawn from a program and then returns and is re-enrolled. Well, this sounds great, right? Yeah, it is if it is done prior to 90 days of the student's initial withdrawal date. Let's take a look at the second visual on the bottom right of the chart. If a student is enrolled in a class and attends for 10 hours or more, we already know that this student is part of the denominator. Let's say after 2 weeks of class, the student starts having attendance issues and is finally withdrawn after 6 consecutive absences. Once withdrawn, the student is out for 75 calendar days and then returns to school and re-enrolls in the class. Well, this is a great scenario. It's perfect. You have recaptured the student and have regained the possibility of moving that student to the next functional level. Now, let's just alter the scenario by a couple days. Let's say that the student returns on day 95. Well, guess what? Too late. I mean, it's great that you recaptured the student, but guess what? Now this student counts twice. He now counts as 2 separate students because he did not re-enroll prior to that 90-day requirement. Not looking so good anymore, huh? Let's move to the second critical factor impacting your NRS performance data. So what am I referring to? Attendance and retention. The ultimate goal here is retention, but we're all well aware of the fact that students who have attendance issues are more likely to drop out of our programs than those with few or no attendance issues. Earlier, I mentioned that retention was directly tied to your post-testing rate. To reiterate, if a student withdraws from your program, you cannot post-test them. Even though we want to retain every student every trimester, for NRS purposes, we need to be strategic and primarily target those students within the WITIS year who have not gained a functional level from one trimester to the next. Remember that any student who does not post-test, even if he or she has been withdrawn from the program, is still counting on your denominator and is counting against you because he's part of your total enrollment. When encountering a situation where a student does not earn you an LCP, either because he's withdrawn or simply did not perform well enough, you need to heavily target this student to ensure that he continues to post-test until he does in fact make that measurable skill gain. Let's look at the visual on the right side of the chart in order to gain a better understanding. Here you have an example where the first student earns an LCP in trimester 1. This student has now been added to the numerator of your NRS performance formula. Remember, 1 LCP per student per WITIS year. Now the second student does not earn an LCP the first trimester. Let's say he dropped out, since we're specifically addressing attendance and retention. You need to target the student and work hard to re-enroll him the second trimester in order to post-test him. Here the student gains the LCP in trimester 2, so technically he's off your radar. The student, or the third student, is the most critical. This student is already enrolled in the first trimester and failed to gain the LCP, and in the second trimester failed to get the LCP, and now you only have 1 trimester left to remedy the situation. You really have to work hard to re-enroll this student and have him attend regularly so that he has a shot at making that functional level gain. If you fail to do this by the 3rd trimester, it's too late, and he will only remain on your denominator. Now, to summarize, you basically have the entire WITIS year to move a student from one functional level to the next. If you fail to do so within that WITIS year, the student will count against you in determining your NRS performance percent for that year. It's critical for you to focus specifically on students who do not gain an LCP throughout the WITIS year, regardless of whether the student is not performing or not present. The impact is still going to be the same. As the WITIS year progresses, you need to target more heavily those students demonstrating no functional level gain. So, critical factor number 3, your post-testing rate. So when we refer to the post-testing rate, we're talking about just that. What percent of your students enrolled actually post-test? But before we get to the nitty-gritty of it, let's look at the bullets on this slide. Most programs throughout the state post-test students once at the end of the trimester. You know, some students withdraw from a program without post-testing and then return and are tested without first re-enrolling them in the course. In situations like these, the first one or the second, you forego the possibility of earning a reportable LCP. And then finally, this third bullet on this slide refers to students who post-test after the course end date. And the thought pattern here is that it's important to try to test them within 7 days of withdrawal, and that's just because it's so much easier to get that LCP, and we'll look into it in depth in a few slides, but I just wanted you to keep that in mind. We know that the state target is to attain a minimum 70% post-testing rate, all right? We already know that it's directly tied to your performance rate. Now, if a student does not post-test, he or she is going to count against you in the denominator. We've already established it. So every time that your post-testing rate drops, your performance rate is going to drop. And the math is actually pretty simple. If you only post-test 50% of your students, then that already drops your performance rate to 50%. And that's assuming that every single student there is going to gain 1 LCP. Let's look at the 2 examples visually represented at the right of the table. And both of these are examples of students who do post-test and make a functional level gain. However, in the first example, the gain is not reportable. In this first example, the student returns to post-test, but is not re-enrolled in the course prior to post-testing. So even though the student does actually make a functional gain and can move to the next level, you have foregone the ability to report that LCP for NRS performance. In the second one, you know, you have to be careful because here's the end of the trimester, end of December 19, right? And what happens if the student does not post-test at the end of the trimester? You have to wait until January until he re-enrolls. So you want to make sure that you are mindful of this. Now, before we move to the last critical factor, let's address the minimum number of instructional hours that are required for post-testing. Folks, please be sure that you follow the test publisher's recommended number of hours of instruction, and remember also that you can accumulate instructional hours from the prior test to the present, even if it crosses from one trimester to the next. And let's just look at an example on the next slide. So, how do we count instructional hours to determine if a student has met the minimum number of hours? In this example, the student post-tested early in the first trimester. So instructional hours accumulate after the first post-test, right? You add these instructional hours during the second semester. Together, the sum of the total hours here equals 72 hours, which, according to the test publisher, meets the minimum instructional time requirement. Since the student is ready to post-test, he can be tested at 72 hours rather than having to wait to post-test at the end of the trimester. I know some of you are rolling your eyes, but I want you to listen. Now, we are at critical factor number 4, post-testing performance. So we know that post-testing rate impacts post-testing performance, right? In addition to the technicalities that we've talked about, let's look at the instructional component for a minute. You know, students who are not well prepared to test will test poorly. We've addressed instruction and instructional resources in a numerous amount of IP-Day webinars, and this isn't what this training is about. But with regards to instruction, I do want you to keep in mind that it must be data and competency or standards driven. So let's talk about, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the post-testing frequency. Yes, for those of you that are still rolling your eyes, if you test a student once per trimester, then think about it. That student only has one shot at making a measurable skill gain. If the student has more than one opportunity to post-test, then that student is going to have more than one opportunity to move up a functional level. You know, it's pretty simple math. We also need to consider that the more often that you're exposed to something, the more comfortable you become and the less anxious you are. And this applies to post-testing as well. Another important point is that if a student is confident and well prepared for post-testing, then odds are that student is going to do well. And this begins by knowing what the test level and form that the student's going to be post-tested on and the content is all about. Now, we at IPDA have been mentioning for some time now that we're field testing individualized instructional student plans for TABE 11-12. And these plans identify all the content that's going to be post-tested based on subject area and test level. What we have seen so far with our control groups is that the students are performing significantly better when post-testing when these plans are used to identify and target their deficiency. So prior to post-testing, be sure that you review the student's individualized plans. Go over any pending content that remains non-mastered. Be sure the student has demonstrated at least 70 to 75% mastery of all tested content. And this is going to give a student a higher chance at making that measurable gain. So as your students move from one functional level to the next, so will your post-testing performance. All right, I love this slide because it kind of summarizes everything. So I'm going to just go into it with a little bit of detail. First of all, timelines are important. Heck, timelines are critical. Scheduling details are important. If you make an error concerning any of these, you might forego earning your LCP, even though you've worked hard. So in other words, if the student technically gains a functional level when post-testing, it might not count towards your performance if your timing is off. So let's look at each one of these numbers. On number 1, before the first day of class, be sure that you pre-test your students before you register them for the course. If you register and then pre-test, you may not get the LCP. And number 2, prior to 30 days of the withdrawal date. Well, this is more of a registrar issue, but I did want to bring it up just because it is important. And the significance is that you need to have a separate section. Don't worry too much about it. Just be mindful and share this information with your registrar. Number 3 is critical. It's similar to 2, but if the student returns 90 days after his or her withdrawal date, this student is now counting twice. So you really want to get them back before those 90 days. At number 4, be sure that you re-enter them before you post-test them, please. This is so important. At 5, remember, we want to prepare our students for post-testing. So 10 to 15 hours prior, put them through like a mini boot camp targeting their competencies or standards that are still not mastered. Number 6, be sure that you have ongoing post-testing. Test every 70 hours if you can. Gives them multiple opportunities to pass. And prior to the end of the trimester, number 7, make sure that you test every student who has not yet tested. Finally, at 8, be careful with students that post-test at the end of the trimester or don't post-test at the end of the trimester. Sometimes when you're at the very end of the WITIS year, that LCP will count, but it'll carry over to the following year, and it won't count for the NRS performance for that year. All right, so remember that funding for enrollment begins at 10 hours of direct instructional time. So be sure that you closely monitor all students to ensure they meet this target, right? Now, even though the main focus of this training is on increasing your NRS performance program growth is vital. So as your program improves and grows, and as it gains a reputation for excellence, and as students share positive experience via word of mouth and social media, your NRS performance will be positively impacted. Now, I just wanted to give you some easy tips that will help you grow your student enrollment. First of all, actively recruit. And you have a list of ideas here, but just, assign people to recruit. Visit local businesses, develop a calendar, keep a running log so you know what works and what doesn't work. And number 2 here, develop, promote, and regularly update your web page. Ensure you have a web page for your school with program offerings, activities calendar, contact information that is useful and current. If you look at this slide, which page would you explore? The small one on the left, it just says welcome to the classroom and has no real information. What about the one on the right? Look at this one. This one has the school name, easy to read drop-down menus at the top. It's got home, about us, admissions, programs, financial aid, student resources, employee resources. It highlights new student registration. It has an online appointment system, high school application. the layout is clean and it's easy to read. Basically, it's pretty inviting. This is actually a website for George T. Baker Aviation Technical College in Miami-Dade County. And as I navigated through the website, I was really impressed that it was so easy to use and the information was so current. 3, please regularly use multiple sources of social media. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Snapchat, and other social media platforms can help you market yourself and stay connected with interested or target groups. Now, before we continue to explore specific strategies and best practices for recruiting students, let's just look at a simple resource you can easily create in Excel or Access to gauge the effectiveness of your recruiting efforts. And then this is critical information if you really want to develop an effective recruiting plan. By the way, there's a full-page sample in your resource handbook. All right, so notice that in the last column to the right, you can document whether or not the student has reached the minimum 10 hours of direct instruction for funding purposes, right? Important. Look at this one. Number 4, we're going to show the career benefit of the program, right? Of your curriculum. What is the value of attending your program? What unique services can you provide? How can your courses translate beneficially to the workplace? Look at this example. Even though it's a CTE program, you can link your Eastland ABE programs as key transition programs to post-secondary educational options that lead to high-paying jobs and fulfilling careers. And 5, you can deliver flexible, blended, and accelerated learning options. Tell your students, hey, we got many ways for you to learn. Include any supporting software programs you offer. Do you offer tutoring for students who need additional assistance or who are returning from an absence and need extra support? This is a great selling point. At 6, train all your staff to respond in a timely manner. We all know customer service is key. And honestly, having your customers wait more than 24 hours for a return call is just bad business. Share student success stories. Highlight success stories on your web page or through your social media. Post stories in classrooms and hallways and offices. At 8, play to your strengths. Every program's unique. What are your strengths? How do you compare to other schools, other adult programs? Are your programs less expensive, accelerated, high performing? Do you provide career counseling to assist students into transitioning to post-secondary educational options? Do you offer a blended learning program option? At 9, facilitate the enrollment process. Even though some of the procedures are clear, actually most enrollment procedures are very clear, right? You can still make things a lot more simplified and streamlined. What about if you have an appointment system set up so students don't have to stand in line wasting valuable time? What about if you can post enrollment steps so that it makes it easier for them to follow the process? Require documentation. Post it so that they can see that what they need to bring to register for your programs. Customer service, customer service, customer service. Oh my goodness, customer service is key. It makes all the difference in the world, but it isn't something that just happens by displaying posters. So be specific with all of your employees as to what customer service means at your school site. What does it look like? How do you handle irate students? Request feedback from your students. Have frank conversations, where they feel comfortable in helping you identify areas for improvement. And remember, please have a strong work ethic because that is a key ingredient to providing outstanding customer service. There's a link in your resource handbook also for additional support ideas. All right, attendance. Let's talk about attendance and retention strategies. So attendance, we already know, refers to being present in school, and retention refers to regular attendance over time. With regard to your NRS performance, the state goal is 70%, right? Post-testing rate. So that means that retention has to be at least 70%. Now, let's look at some strategies and best practices you can implement to work on this. We want to keep it simple. So the first one we're going to look at is market attendance as a priority in your school. Let your students know that attendance is important. Post posters in classrooms and hallway. You might want to set up an attendance wall where you can highlight classrooms with the best weekly attendance rate. And by the way, this graphics here, you have a full page version in your resource handbook if you would like to reproduce it. Connect with your students via email, texting. The main benefit of instant messaging is just that, it's instant. With IM messages, they're usually read within 90 seconds of being sent. So that means you can really communicate with students in real time, and it's free. At 3, please keep morale high with good instruction. This is a given. We all know this. We're all educators. Set high but attainable goals. Define objectives. Hold award ceremony. Add instructional games to your repertoire of classroom activities. Make lessons relevant. Differentiate instruction. Encourage and use positive competition. Allow students to work together. Provide specific feedback and give them opportunities to improve. All right. And boost learning, please. Let's talk about implementing an incentive plan. All right, so an incentive plan is really all about building community and building relationships. It's about providing support. And remember that your efforts will be most effective if they're part of a more comprehensive approach. So reach out to your students, establish a school-wide culture of attendance, emphasize student engagement throughout the trimester. Some of the things that you can do are listed here. You can have your names on the attendance wall, attendance certificates, breakfast, lunch, or dinner with a principal, choice of donated items, parking space near the building for most improved attendance. And just on a sidebar, I really want to tell you how important lunch or dinner or breakfast with a principal is. This is my definite winner. Not only is it a way to recognize the students, but it gives you such a unique opportunity to get real feedback on your programs. The students feel valued when asked for their input, and they feel special that you take the time to speak with them. At 6, provide an instructional support system for students when they're returning after a period of absence, or for students who are re-enrolling after having been withdrawn. Do extra lab time before or after class. Assign them a tutor to help them catch up. Have online follow-up activities or lessons. And address, whenever possible, issues impacting student attendance. Issues like childcare, transportation. All communities are different, but you can always find ways to address issues that impact student attendance. Like, for example, if you have issues with students getting back to school, or getting to school actually, you may be able to just connect students so they can carpool. Or you may even be able to obtain free transportation passes. Do the research, find some solution. Conduct daily class counts. Now, this recommendation is more for administrators and teachers. So administrators, conduct daily class counts of all classrooms. Don't just do it once a day. Do it twice a day. 30 minutes into the class and 30 minutes prior to the end of class. Share this data with the teachers. You may want to display the data in a chart so that both the teachers and the students, can see that the importance of attendance. See if there are any patterns. Are students consistently absent on Mondays or Fridays? Discuss this with your teachers and come up with activities to build connections in your classrooms and school on these days. For example, you may want to have Coffee Mondays or Friday films. Just be sure that if you do not supplant classroom instruction with frivolous activities. Like, for example, if you're implementing Friday films, be sure that the content is relevant to what's being covered in class and build that lesson around it. Designate someone to regularly call students when they're absent. We all know that most of our adult education teachers are part-time teachers, and they're going to be resistant most of the time to making student calls on their own time. Many have multiple jobs, so rotate clerical personnel to help out. And just remember that any student who withdraws from your program and doesn't gain the hours to post-test or doesn't do well will count against you. So this piece is super critical for you. At 10, track absences, withdrawal, and reentries. And now, number 10 obviously goes hand in hand with number 9. And look at the sample spreadsheet on this slide. You have a large version in your resource handbook, by the way. Meet with your leadership team, your administrative team. Decide when you're going to contact students for attendance. Are you going to call them after one absence, or are you going to wait for 3 consecutive absences? The one thing you should all agree on is that you should absolutely be contacting every single student who withdraws. Yes, every single one. And in most situations, you are going to find a solution to getting them back. All right, so we are now at the third critical factor impacting our NRS performance data. Okay, so keep an open mind as we're going to explore specific strategies and best practices to increase your post-testing rate. So you really have three key components to increasing your rate. The first two, absolutely. The third one's kind of like a very strong suggestion. But first, establish an ongoing post-testing program. Second, you're going to re-enroll withdrawn students prior to post-testing. And then you're going to absolutely try to post-test within 7 calendar days of the end of course date. Now let's look at each of these individually along with some resources. Establish an ongoing post-testing program. So consider the minimum number of instructional hours required for a student to be eligible for post-testing. Remember that it varies by test, okay? Let's look at this at-a-glance chart summarizing the instructional hour requirements for our most commonly used tests for ESOL and ABE. Always be sure to keep abreast of any recommended instructional hour requirements by the test publishers. You know, this information is posted online. And also remember you have to adhere to your district's testing policy guidelines as well. So let's explore how having an ongoing testing program increases the number of opportunities each student is going to have towards gaining that LCP. Remember that we only count 1 LCP per student per WITIS year. So let's take a closer look at this chart. This chart in particular represents the 3 trimesters in the current 2019-20 WITIS year. Now it's an example and may not be 100% representative of the number of instructional days and hours of instruction per day for your particular district and school site, but nonetheless, it still serves to answer the question. If there are 81 instructional days in trimester 1 and a student attends 3 instructional hours per day, he or she is going to have an opportunity to test up to 4 times that trimester. If we look at trimester 2, there are 62 instructional days at 3 hours per day equals a total of 186 instructional hours. When we divide 186 by the recommended number of instructional hours, 60 in this case, we see that in trimester 2, a student can test up to 3 times. In trimester 3, a student can test up to 3 times as well. So, in overall, when we look at the entire 2019-20 WITIS year, as represented here, a student can have up to 10 opportunities to post-test and earn an LCP. Now, if we had just post-tested at the end of each trimester, the maximum number of opportunities that this student would have had would have been 3. By increasing the number of post-testing opportunities, you are increasing your ability to gain an LCP from your students. Now, please, folks, remember that we test with a purpose. So we don't randomly test every student that reaches the minimum hourly instructional hour requirement, right? We want to make sure that they are prepared. So be sure that they have mastered at least 70 to 75% of the tested content. So as part of our ongoing post-testing program, we need to address certain issues that might present a challenge. Please be sure that you look at these in depth. I don't want to go through all of them because you do have them here, but and I do want to get to more critical information, but look through these bullets and make sure that you test every single one of your students as often as you can, and that you try to gain and emphasize that 1 LCP within that 1 WITIS year. All right, this third and last component to increasing the post-testing rate is to ensure that your students post within the 7 days after the end of course date. This is not so much mandatory as it is you want to make sure you get that LCP within the WITIS year. So if you're testing like at the end of the WITIS year in trimester 3, you may have to forego the LCP for the following year. And if you're in December and the student never comes back in January to post-test, you just lost that opportunity. And here's the fourth critical factor with your NRS data. And let's just look at some strategies here. First, I just want to make sure that you see the difference between post-testing rate and post-testing performance. The post-testing rate is 70% minimum. The performance goal for ESOL is 43 right now, and for ABE it is 41. Now, some ways that we can increase: know the breakdown of the test. So know what post-test form and level for each student is going to be used. Create and use the individualized plan. Use computer-assisted instruction whenever possible. And please provide intensive test prep. So, know the breakdown of the test. Let's look at, very quickly, a breakdown of the TABE and the CASAS. Here, I want you to notice that you have kind of like a summary of the breakdown of the TABE 11-12 reading test. You have the breakdown by the test level, E, M, D, and A. It gives you the maximum allowable time, the number of passages, number of items, average word count, lexile, time per passage, and time per question. Make sure that you as an instructor are familiarized with this information and that your students are familiarized with this information. Okay. Here you have the language one. Same breakdown as clearly as we could put it in one chart. You can even print it out and post it. You have a large printable copy in your resource manual. And here is the math test. And by the way, for the math test, be aware that each level has different times. Sometimes students think it's the same time all the way across, and it really isn't. Now, let's look at a breakdown of the CASAS test. When we're looking at a breakdown of this, I want you to notice the breakdown for the listening is on the left, and the breakdown for the reading is on the right. Look at it carefully. It's all put here for you in one simple, easy to read chart. As we move to know the post-test form and level for each student. We have included here the scale score ranges for each area, each level of the test, and the corresponding NRS level. So see where your students fall and what's the next NRS level that they're going into. If you want a more detailed explanation of these charts, you can check the resource manual. It's all written there with specific examples and unique situations. Create your individualized student plans. And here you have a sample calendar that you are able to use for your intensive test prep. These are also, these examples here for these boot camp calendars, the ongoing schedule and end of trimester calendar is available in your resource handbook. So please note the examples and the detailed explanations for each of these. And remind your interventionists, please, to be very strategic. Now, once you have implemented your boot camp, if you want to know exactly what to do, if it's ongoing, you can follow this easy to read chart. And we are unfortunately running out of time, so I don't have time to go over it in detail. And if it's an end of trimester one, you have it right here. Finally, I really do want to look at 6, and I know that I've mentioned it several times, but the 75 to 80% mastery is critical. So if you know that your students are not going to pass the test, even though they've gained the minimum number of hours, don't have them test, please. And we're on our growth mindset this entire year. So please change how you look at enrollment, attendance, retention, and post-testing. Look at key data points and see how they can impact your performance. Redesign, or at least participate in redesigning existing procedures. Review all the information that's been covered in the webinar and look through the comparison resource handbook and share this information with teachers, with administrators, with district personnel, and become an expert yourself. And finally, reflect and make a change. What's working, what isn't, but initiate the changes that need to be made to move your NRS performance data. And June, I'm going to leave you with a rest here. I think we are definitely running out of time.
Maria, thank you so much. You got through a lot of great information. Okay, right now we just want to, any questions that we have here will address to you personally, but I do want you to take just a minute to fill out the feedback slide that is appearing on the screen right now. This is really important to hear from you so that we can continue to improve our trainings. So take a minute to fill out these 3 short questions. Thank you so much for your kind comments. We appreciate it. Okay, the feedback slide will now come off, and I just want to wish all of you a great holiday season. Our next webinar will be in January, on January 8th. We've asked the CEO from CareerSource Capital Region to join us to talk about CareerSource. So until then, I wish you a great holiday season, and thank you for all your support and being with us today. And Maria, thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you all for joining us.